Welcome back to Why We Buy It. Today I want to talk about 3 watches that I don't actually own. And generally on this channel I'm only ever talking about watches I own. But these 3 watches are particularly special to me because if I owned them, I think I'd be done collecting. I think my watch box would be complete. And for those of you that follow the channel already and have seen some of my previous watch videos, you'll know that I have a 6 watch collection. But if I had these 3, that would be it. Right? Maybe I'd still keep 6 watches in the watch box, but the other 3 would generally be inexpensive watches that maybe I could beat up or swap out the odd one here and there just for something that's less expensive and interesting. But these 3 watches would be all it would take for me to say, I'm good. Right? This is the Holy Trinity, so to speak. And what's interesting about these 3 watches is that they're not exactly what you'd expect, right? I'm not talking Rolexes, Patek Philippe's, Vacherons, or anything like that. One brand is particularly recognizable. You might even say amongst the watch community it's the most recognizable brand. Another one is very well known and has options that are relatively affordable. And then the last one is probably a watch brand that the majority of you won't know. Maybe 90% of you will have never heard of. And amongst the 3 watches, one of them I've tried on before and absolutely loved it. Another one I've seen in person, never tried one on, but from the first time I saw one of these watches, I was intrigued. And then the last one I've never actually seen in person, ever. I've only ever seen it online. And if you know me, you'll know that I like to see things in person, try things on wrist before I really attach myself to them. But this watch was so perfect in its design that I thought to myself, there's no way I won't like it, and I'd be very willing to order it sight unseen online and be happy with my purchase. I don't expect anything otherwise. So I'm going to begin in no particular order, but I'm going to begin with the watch that I've actually tried on, then I'll go to the watch I've seen, and then I'll finish off with the watch that I've only ever seen online. Let's get into it. So the first watch on my list is a watch that I would consider to be the most iconic watch from this independent Swiss brand. And there are others who will argue different, and I've actually seen recent videos actually by another popular YouTuber that argued the Diver 65 is the most iconic watch from this particular brand, but I don't think so. I think it's the Big Crown Pointer Date, and of course I'm talking about Oris. The Big Crown Pointer Date is the watch that I would say the majority of watch enthusiasts recognize right away as, oh, that's the Oris, that's the one, right? It stands out amongst so many other watches. But you're probably thinking, Cope, you already own watches that are more expensive than the Oris Big Crown Pointer Date. And the answer would be yes, I do, but also no, I don't. Because the particular model I'm interested in is the model that includes the caliber 403 movement. Now that model is more expensive than anything that's in my collection currently. And the reason I am intrigued by that particular movement is the specs, of course. 120 hours of power reserve is phenomenal. And I'm not talking about what ETA has done with like the Powermatic series of movements where they've slowed it down in order to increase the power reserve. Here you've got a 4 hertz beat rate, right? It's a high beat movement with 120 hours of power reserve. It's impressive. On top of that, it's got an accuracy rating of -3 to +5 seconds per day, so better than COSC, right? This is better than COSC certification. So extremely accurate, right? It's got high levels of anti-magnetism in it, so it's really unaffected by that as well. But what you're getting here is you're getting the best that Oris has to offer. And with their most iconic model, at least in my opinion. And I love the Big Crown Pointer Date, right? I've tried on a number of them. And I've tried on a model with the caliber 403 in it. It's just such a gorgeous watch. It's an understated, very dressy piece with an interesting complication that isn't over the top, right? And I can appreciate that. And those of you that follow the channel know that I like things to be legible. And sure, the pointer date isn't as legible as, say, a big date, but it's more interesting. And for me, the date is the least important aspect of reading the time, right? Generally, you know what day it is. If I don't, I've got other problems, okay? But that is the watch that really intrigues me. And something I want to mention here, and I think it's part of the reason why watch collecting is such an addiction and why people are so attached to finding that next piece, is that you can always find substitutes. And I think that's partially what this video is about, is that you may have an idea in your head of, you know, what are my Grail watches? What are the watches that if I own them, that would be it? Most of us aren't willing to just sit there and wait and save up until we eventually buy our Grail watches and be done with it. Because in the meantime, you've got nothing. You've got this empty spot in your watch box. And when you look at the Big Crown pointer date, there are options, right? Especially when you're looking at the caliber 403. It begins with the obvious. You could just get a standard Big Crown pointer date, right? You could go that route. You're paying probably less than half of what you'd pay for the caliber 403 with a watch that looks pretty much identical, but just isn't the same, especially if you're an enthusiast. You can save a ton of money, and I can order pointer dates off of Amazon here in Canada from Zeppelin. So if I really want a pointer date function, I can go that route. But I mean, it's not the iconic brand that Oris is, an independent Swiss brand of which there's so few left. It's not their iconic model, to be entirely honest, right? It would just be scratching that pointer date itch, which is, I think, something we all do, right? We find alternatives to these watches that we really desire that have similar looks or complications. But in this case, to me, there's nothing that can really satisfy that itch unless I get the caliber 403. And if I just look at the 120 hours of power reserve, there's options there as well. Baume & Mercier, I've seen a number of Baume & Mercier 5-day power reserve models that I could have got at a pretty significant discount because Baume & Mercier is kind of overlooked. But again, I don't really want a Baume & Mercier. I don't. I want that Oris. That's the one that's going to really satisfy it for me. And if I get it, I don't need another dress piece. That's the Oris. Let me know if you're a fan of that particular model in the comments. And let's get on to the next one. And next up is a watch from the most recognizable watch brand, in my personal opinion, amongst watch enthusiasts. And it's a brand that I was aware of before I was really even that into watches. I mean, I've always kind of owned watches, right? I've always had them. Since I was a teenager, I had watches, but I didn't really become a watch enthusiast until like the early 2000s, right? But way before then, I was intrigued by this particular brand. And that's Panerai, right? You can recognize a Panerai from across the room. You can recognize a Panerai from across the street if you get a decent look, right? That's just the image they've built for themselves. They stuck to a certain design language, regardless of what's popular at the time, to produce a series of watches that are unmistakably Panerai. And when I think Panerai, I think Luminor, okay? It's the locking mechanism over the crown that really stands out to me. There's nothing wrong with the Radomir, but it's the Luminor that really grabs my attention. And amongst those, it's the submersible and the Luna Rossa. I just love the colorway. The Luna Rossa stands out to me, and something it shares in common with the Oris, of course, is they both use a small seconds complication, which I absolutely love. I love small seconds. You know, if I really wanted to go inexpensive on the small seconds complication, I could get something like a Citizen Ciosa, but is that really going to scratch the itch in comparison to an Oris Big Crown pointer date or a Panerai submersible Luna Rossa? No, it's not. It's not. And once again, the Panerai comes in with some very impressive specs. It's got the high beat movement. It's got 72 hours of power reserve. It's got 300 meters of water resistance. It's literally built like a tank. It's reminiscent of a tank in its design. I mean, I just love the no-nonsense boldness of a Panerai. But amongst the three watches I've selected, it's by far the most expensive. your standard submersible Luna Rossa, you're looking at like $11,000 American. I mean, it's unlikely I'd ever spend that kind of money on a watch. So it's unlikely I'm ever going to own one, to be entirely honest with you. Right? I'd have to find one on the secondary market at a significant discount that's still in decent shape, because I'm kind of a stickler about condition. So I don't see this particular watch in, my foreseeable future. I don't. But I absolutely love it, and I'll always admire it. And if I see somebody who has one, I understand why. And I've mentioned before on previous videos and on our social media channels and in conversations with other watch enthusiasts about, how the price of certain watches gets to a point where it's almost a bit ridiculous to me, right? I would never see myself, especially when people are talking about over like $20,000 for a watch. It's like, to me, that's a car, and I'm a car enthusiast, and why would you spend over $20,000 on a watch? And those that do, more power to you. Obviously, you've got the money to do it. You've got the money to burn. And money's no object. And in that situation, sure, go ahead. But I don't think this hobby would be as much fun, to be honest with you, if I could just buy whatever I wanted. I think it's that yearning for a particular model, right? Searching for it or finding something that can fulfill that void is what makes this hobby so enticing in the first place. It doesn't surprise me when I see things advertised like Tom Brady's going to sell a bunch of watches from his collection on auction, some of which are like one of ones because they were specifically made for him, but he doesn't care. He can just get another one made for him, right? He's got the money to burn. So his connection to those watches isn't as great as maybe my connection would be if I had a watch like this, if I eventually somehow got a watch like this. So that particular Panerai is just like, it blows me away, right? And if I really wanted to go next level, they have the same design and model, only in the carbon tech material, the forged carbon material that looks awesome. But now you're looking at like $18,000. It just gets crazier, right? But that's a watch that I don't think any watch enthusiast can look at and not be intrigued by, regardless of the budget you have at hand. It's one of those pieces that's just iconic. Let's get on to the last one. Now, the last watch of the three, and by no means the least, this may actually be my favorite watch of the trio, is by a watch manufacturer out of France that the majority of you probably have never heard of, okay? The company's called Reservoir Watches, and they have modified a Sellita movement. The caliber goes by the moniker of RSV 240 and created a particular style of watch for car enthusiasts like myself that is reminiscent of a car gauge, right? Of an RPM dial. And all of those designs are intriguing. There are two that I like a little bit more than the others. There's the 390 fastback model, but the one that really stands out to me, for me, it's the Longbridge Club. And the Longbridge Club comes in with a 41.5 millimeter case, which is a great size for me. They do have a smaller case size, but with a dial like that, I want it as legible and as big as possible when it comes right down to it. But what makes this particular movement special is it includes so many interesting complications. You've got the retrograde minutes, so it counts the minutes along the outer track with a 270-degree span of motion, and then jumps from the 60-second back to 0. So it actually circumnavigates the full face, but only uses 270 degrees of it. Amazing. It's got the jump hour complication. So it's obviously quite easy to read, even though the dial itself might look a bit busy. It's a snap to read the time. And then you've got another complication I personally love, which is a power meter. Okay, now this particular movement has 56 hours of power reserve, which of course isn't to the level of the Panerai or not even close to the level of the Oris, but 56 hours is still an acceptable and appealing power reserve to me because it's beyond the 2-day mark, right? I've had enough of the whole, 28, 24 movements or such. Like anything within these 38 to 45 hour power reserves. I want at least 48 hours. I want the full 2 days available to me, and this achieves that. But you look at that dial and immediately you recognize it as a car gauge if you're at all interested in vintage cars. But at the same time, it's very easy to read and understand. And then the Longbridge Club is the one that kind of stands out to me that little bit extra because it's got the 2 jewels that are reminiscent of car lights with the green and the blue. It's spectacular. It's absolutely amazing. It scratches the itch for 2 hobbies in one item I can wear on my wrist. And I don't have to go out and buy a vintage car to make up for it, because I live in the heart of the city in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And if you're unaware, we have some of the worst city traffic, period, in North America. I wouldn't say the world, because I've been places, like Vietnam and Bangkok and such, where the traffic is insane. But for North America, it's hard to find worse traffic than in Toronto. So I actually don't own a car, right? I get around by transit and bike. As much as I love cars, it's not something that's practical here. But a watch like this is, if you're a enthusiast like myself, and you don't mind spending a little extra. This comes in just a fraction higher than the price of the Oris, although this being an independent sort of micro brand to a certain extent, you can't just find them anywhere. The Oris has a secondary market that you can eventually find something for a bit of a discount, maybe used, in good condition still, but when it comes to a Reservoir watch, chances are you're going to have to buy it directly from Reservoir themselves or an authorized dealer, of which they do have a few boutiques in big market areas like New York and such that you could, get one. But again, you're probably paying pretty close to MSRP on it. So it's not a cheap watch by any means, and it's not an easy watch to get unless you've got the money to pay for it. And this is the one watch that I think would scratch that itch that so many other watches can be sort of acquired to fill, because it has so much in one watch. It has the interesting dial, right? It's got some very classic complications, right? You've got the power reserve, which I've mentioned before is a very usable complication, a very practical complication, although one that's been overlooked by many different watch brands. It's got the retrograde minutes, which is so kind of harking back to the early days of horology. It's just an incredible watch. And then that unique look of it is fantastic. And this is a situation where I've actually gone ahead and purchased a watch to sort of fill the itch, because I did pick up another watch for a significantly discounted price that has a very similar looking dial to this. It just doesn't have all the complications. It doesn't have the power reserve. It doesn't have the retrograde minutes. It just has that car gauge looking dial. And I'll show you that watch in another video. But those are the 3 watches that if I own them, that'll be it for me. Those are the 3 that just would kind of do it all. I'd have a sports watch, I'd have a dress watch, I'd have an intriguing watch. And I could cover any situation and just keep me enthused every time I open the watch box. Let me know what your 3 watches are, or maybe what your 1 Grail watch is in the comments. Until next time, if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. Like 95% of you haven't subscribed yet. It would really help the channel out. We want to bring you as much new content as possible, and it kind of keeps us going and kind of fires up our juices when we see new subscribers on the channel. So please do it. Till next time.